Imagine this. A state-of-the-art Boeing 787, gleaming on the tarmac. It's about to take off. Conditions are perfect. You've got a crew that's fully rested. All the systems checks come back green. I mean, everything points to a completely routine textbook flight. It's exactly what you expect, right? Safety, reliability. But then literally in a handful of seconds, everything changes catastrophically. Today, we're going to dive deep into a really tragic and, frankly, deeply unsettling case. Air India Flight AIA 171. This disaster claimed 270 lives. It stands as the worst crash in Indian aviation history. Now, the official preliminary report, when it finally came out, it seemed to point in one particular direction, kind of suggesting a clear narrative. But our sources, and we've looked at a lot, articles, research papers, expert notes, reveal something much more complex, a troubling web of possibilities, really. We're talking everything from, yes, potential human error in the cockpit, to perhaps systemic failures hidden within the aircraft's design, and even, these persistent whispers of a high-level cover-up, maybe to protect some powerful interests.
So our mission today is to carefully unpack those critical seconds of flight AIA 171. We need to examine the evidence we have, weigh the official lines against some of these hidden details, and really try to understand why the questions surrounding this crash just won't go away. It's not just about what happened. We need to get into the why and what that could mean for flying safety going forward. Okay, let's start to unpack this. Right, let's set the scene. The date is June 12th, 2025. We're talking about Air India Flight AIA 171. It's scheduled to fly from Ahmedabad International Airport in India all the way to London Gatwick, a standard long-haul international flight. Hundreds of people heading to their destination. And the pre-flight stuff, our sources show it was completely by the book. Absolute standard, hours before takeoff, all the usual procedures. At 11:25 a.m., the whole crew, they do their mandatory pre-flight breathalyzer tests. Results, totally normal, clear for everyone. And this is important, the flight log showed both pilots, the captain and the first officer, hadn't flown in the previous 24 hours. So they were definitely well rested, no fatigue issues that could cloud their judgment,
Then, closer to departure, around 12:30 p.m., the crew's seen at the boarding gate, getting ready. At the same time, down on the tarmac at Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel International Airport, the ground crew starts the pre-flight checks on 787 itself and the conditions outside. As good as you could possibly ask for. Visibility was excellent, miles and miles. Wind was calm, no tricky crosswinds. And the general weather, just fine. Clear skies, no storms lurking, nothing adverse at all. Outwardly, everything looks set for a smooth, easy departure. And the plane itself, this Boeing 787-8, a really advanced wide-body jet known for being efficient, sophisticated, on board, 230 passengers, 12 crew members, that's 242 people in total. He was carrying a lot of fuel, 54,000 liters, obviously needed for that long trip. But even with all that passengers, crew, fuel load, the aircraft was still comfortably below its maximum allowed takeoff weight. It's not overloaded. And one final check. Absolutely no dangerous cargo, nothing hazardous on board. That possibility is ruled out. A clean flight. So everything's looking good. At 1:18 p.m., AIA 171 starts its taxi from parking bay 34. It's heading towards runway 23. At this exact moment, every system, every indicator in the cockpit is showing normal. Everything's in the green. Pilots are getting all the right signals. It looks like a textbook departure scenario, unfolding just as it should. Then comes the critical moment. Takeoff clearance from air traffic control for runway 23. That's at 1:37 p.m. Clearance received. Those big GE engines start spooling up, building thrust. The takeoff procedure begins. Just a minute later, 1:38 p.m. precisely. This huge aircraft, hundreds of tons of metal and technology, lifts off the runway, airborne, climbing away. It looks like a perfect start. But this right here is where things take a sudden, terrifying, and frankly baffling turn.
Yes, and it's so important to really grasp how completely normal everything was up to that exact second. Just as you've laid it out, you have this cutting-edge plane, a rested, experienced crew, perfect weather, all systems checked and double-checked, green across the board. For any pilot, this is the dream scenario. Everything is working for you. Every single indicator pointed to a routine flight. Nothing, absolutely nothing suggested any kind of problem. What's truly fascinating and profoundly disturbing is how quickly that perfect picture just shattered. It went from routine to utter chaos in, seconds? It really sets the stage for the mystery, doesn't it? How could it all go so wrong so incredibly fast when everything seemed so right?
And shatter it did, catastrophically. Just seconds after the plane got airborne, climbing steadily at exactly 1:38 p.m. and 42 seconds. The aircraft hits its stride, gaining speed, gaining altitude, performing just like it's supposed to in that initial climb phase. But then, right after that, the plane's black boxes, the enhanced airborne flight recorders, the EFR, they capture something unbelievable, terrifying. The fuel supply to both engines, engine 1 and engine 2, is cut off. Instantly. abruptly. Not a gradual power loss, a complete stop. The EFR data shows the fuel cutoff switches, which are located up on the overhead panel right between the two pilots. They moved from the run position to the cutoff position, and our sources stress this point. It happened in just 1 second, both switches, simultaneously. Think about that, 1 second.
Right. And to really get the weight of that, we need to talk about these switches. They aren't like your light switch at home, not at all. These fuel cutoff switches, they have very specific uses. You use them on the ground to shut down the engines after parking. That's normal. Or, and this is extremely rare, in a dire airborne emergency like an engine fire, you need to stop the fuel flow immediately. Now, what's fascinating, as you said, is their design. They're built to be robust, really robust. They're spring-loaded. You actually have to physically lift them up against that spring tension before you can move them back or forward. And on top of that, they have these quite substantial guardrails around them. Why? To stop accidental activation. You bump it with your elbow in turbulence, it shouldn't move. So we connect this to the bigger picture. The design itself screams deliberate action. It's built to resist accidental bumps. It needs a very specific two-step physical input for both switches to move together in 1 second. Well, from an engineering point of view, that's incredibly unlikely without either deliberate intent or some kind of major system malfunction.
Yeah, exactly. That design, meant for deliberate action, makes what the cockpit voice recorder, the CVR, picked up next even more chilling. It's absolutely central here. Our sources say the CVR captured this, well, bewildering exchange right after the fuel cut. One pilot is heard asking the other, and the tone is apparently one of shock, surprise, disbelief. Why did you cut off? And the other pilot's response is immediate, unequivocal, and seemingly just as astonished. I didn't do that. Whoop. This quick back and forth happening in just seconds. It's a critical piece. It really challenges that simple explanation of, oh, a pilot made a mistake. If it was an error, they seemed utterly baffled by it themselves.
It does. It profoundly complicates the narrative of simple, intentional pilot error, doesn't it? If one pilot is flat out denying it, and the other is asking in, apparent confusion, this raises an important question. What was actually happening in that cockpit? Were they both truly unaware of what caused it? Was one perhaps covering up an immediate catastrophic mistake, which seems unlikely given the need for clear communication in emergencies? Or does it hint at something else entirely, something beyond human intent, something external maybe that forced those switches? That short dialogue really forces us to look beyond the pilots and ask how those robust guarded switches got into the cutoff position. It shifts the focus from who to how and why.
And the grim sequence of events just keeps rolling. At 1:38 p.m. and 47 seconds, that's just 5 seconds after the fuel cut, the EFR logs the N2 values for both engines dropping. N2, for our listeners, that's the core engine speed, a key indicator of power output. They fell below minimum idle. That's the undeniable proof. The engines had lost power. They were essentially dead weight at that point, providing no thrust. Now the plane systems reacted instantly. The ram air turbine, the RAT, it's a small emergency turbine. It deploys automatically from the aircraft belly into the airflow. Its job is to provide emergency hydraulic and electrical power to keep the essential flight controls working, even with no engine power. A last resort system. The pilots, meanwhile, they're fighting. Desperately fighting against the clock, losing altitude fast, just seconds after getting airborne. They made these valiant attempts to save the aircraft. At 1:38 p.m. and 52 seconds, just 5 seconds after the engine died down, fuel cutoff switch for engine number 1 gets moved back from cutoff to run. And then only seconds later at 1:38 p.m. and 56 seconds, engine number 2 switch is also slammed back to run. You can see the speed, the coordination. They're trying everything to get power back under immense pressure.
And this is where the sophistication of the 787 systems comes into play, trying to salvage the situation. As soon as those switches went back to run, the FADC system, that's the full authority digital engine control, the engine's brain basically automatically kicked off an engine relight sequence and a thrust recovery sequence. It's designed to manage the engine and attempt restarts autonomously in flight. It's incredibly clever. And we have the data, the exhaust gas temperature readings, the EGT from the recorders. They're really revealing. They show both engines were actually starting up again. The temperature was rising, fast fuel igniting, turbine spooling. Even more promising, engine number 1's core speed stopped decelerating. Its N2 actually started to rise, a clear sign it was recovering, fighting to come back online.
But just heartbreakingly, engine number 2 didn't respond in the same way. Despite the relight attempt, its core speed kept dropping. It just wouldn't recover.
And that, right there, is the absolute tragedy of it. The FADC was working, engines were trying to relight, engine 1 was even showing signs of life. Had the aircraft been just maybe a few hundred meters higher, maybe another 10-15 seconds of climb time, just that little bit more altitude, even one recovering engine could potentially have been enough power to maybe limp back, circle, and attempt a landing. But the pilots, at that critical moment just after takeoff, they had neither the altitude nor the time needed for that recovery sequence to complete. They were simply too low, too close to the ground. The margin for error during takeoff is virtually zero.
The inevitable arrived with devastating speed. At 1:39 p.m. and 5 seconds, the pilots get on the radio, the desperate call. Mayday, mayday, mayday. The universal signal of extreme distress telling air traffic control they were in catastrophic trouble. But it was already over. Just 6 seconds later, at 1:39 p.m. and 11 seconds, the EFR, the flight recorder, stops recording. The data stream cuts out. AI-171 hit the ground with immense force, erupting into what witnesses called a ball of fire. All 270 people on board were lost. The worst disaster in Indian aviation history.
It's just the brutal reality of physics in aviation, especially during takeoff. The margins are razor thin, the aircraft is heavy, it's climbing, it's working hard, it doesn't have excess speed or altitude to play with, losing power completely from both engines at that exact moment. It was, quite simply, fatal. It highlights just how critical and unforgiving that phase of flight is and how devastating the immediate loss of all thrust was. They ran out of altitude and they ran out of time.
Now, after something so catastrophic, you'd expect, well, immediate transparency, wouldn't you? A thorough public debriefing. But our sources say that 1 month after the crash, the Indian government released its preliminary report. And here's the thing. It was done without any press conference, without taking any questions. Just quietly put out there, almost buried. And this quiet release, instead of providing clarity, did the opposite. Our sources confirm it just increased the number of questions and rumors, especially around that core unanswered question. Who or what caused both fuel switches to cut off simultaneously? And why? It created a vacuum, and you know what fills a vacuum? Speculation, doubt, suspicion.
Let's go back to those switches again, because their design is just so central here. We said they're robust, spring-loaded, guarded. They required that deliberate lift and slide action. The idea of accidentally hitting both of them at the same time in 1 second. It's not just unusual, it's practically unheard of in aviation history. From a human factor standpoint, it's incredibly improbable. So this raises an important question. How can a preliminary report lean towards, or at least allow the conclusion of, pilot error for such a unique, physically unlikely event without deeply exploring the mechanical possibilities? It just doesn't quite add up, given how those switches are supposed to work.
Exactly. And aviation safety experts, investigators, even just informed observers, they've been digging through records precisely because of this. They're searching for any precedent. Any other case where both fuel cutoff switches were accidentally flipped like this simultaneously? And the answer seems to be, there isn't one. Not in this manner. Not in 1 second. It makes AI-171 a genuine, baffling anomaly. And it's really important for you listening to remember what a preliminary report is for. Especially after a crash like this, its main job isn't just saying what happened, but alerting the industry to potential dangers, preventing it from happening again. If there's a fault with the plane, these reports are meant to trigger immediate warnings, airworthiness directives, mandatory checks for other airlines flying the same model. That's how safety improves. Yet, despite this unprecedented, catastrophic failure on AI-171, the preliminary report said, and this is a direct quote, "At this stage of investigation, there is no recommended actions for Boeing 787-8 and or other GE engines." Astonishing, right? And our sources add, no other warning issued, no other action taken regarding this switch matter. It's like this event, killing 270 people, involving a critical system failure with no precedent, somehow required no immediate action. The report essentially gave the plane's design a clean bill of health.
And that, right there, is what sets alarm bells ringing for anyone in the aviation safety world. Really loud bells. If we connect this to the bigger picture, why would a report designed to flag risks explicitly say no action required after such a critical, unique failure? A failure involving components specifically designed not to fail this way. It's highly irregular. It strongly suggests, or at least opens the door to the possibility, that maybe the priority wasn't purely safety analysis, but perhaps managing the potential fallout, hiding a deeper issue. It certainly seems to prioritize avoiding wider implications for the manufacturer and the fleet over proactive safety measures. It's a very uncomfortable conclusion to draw, but the report's statement is hard to ignore.
So, maybe it's not surprising then that with the official report offering no convincing alternative, some Western media outlets quickly jumped on the pilot error explanation. It's simple, it's contained, it closes the book quickly. But then you have that CVR recording, that chilling exchange. Why did you cut off? I didn't do that. That recording just throws a massive spanner in the works for the simple pilot error theory, doesn't it? It captures this raw amazement and confusion. That doesn't sound like someone who just made a deliberate, albeit mistaken, action. It sounds more like pilots reacting to something unexpected happening to them, struggling to grasp it themselves.
Precisely. That exchange is incredibly powerful. In that high-pressure, highly trained cockpit environment, immediate confusion and denial like that, it really challenges the idea of a conscious mistake. As our sources rightly point out, that reaction could equally be a software error and hardware error. Imagine a glitch, an electrical short, something causing those switches to move without pilot input. The pilot's reaction on the CVR would make perfect sense then, wouldn't it? They'd be just as baffled as the recording suggests.
And the report did rule out a lot of the common simpler causes. That's important too. No contaminated fuel. Flap settings were normal, 5 degrees. Landing gear was down, also normal for that phase. And like we said, no bird strikes, no engine debris ingestion, no bad weather. All the usual suspects were eliminated. Plus, the pilots themselves checked out. Medically fit, properly credentialed, experienced on the 787. It wasn't an issue of competence. And the plane wasn't overweight or unbalanced. So when you strip away all these standard explanations, so what does this all mean? You're left with this core mystery. And in that vacuum, it's easy to either blame the pilots, who tragically can't offer their side of the story, or, let conspiracy theories run wild. A third person in the cockpit, sabotage. Even pilot suicide, though there's often zero evidence for that. These ideas rush in when the official explanation feels incomplete.
And it's just so critical we resist those easy answers, especially, when you consider the stakes. Multi-billion-dollar companies like Boeing, whose reputation was already, let's say, tarnished by previous issues. Blaming the pilots, the deceased pilots, is often seen as an easy way out. It avoids confronting those deeper, much more uncomfortable questions about potential design flaws or manufacturing issues, questions that could have massive financial and legal implications for the manufacturer. It shifts the focus very conveniently away from the machine and onto the humans who can no longer speak. It's a pattern we've unfortunately seen before.
What we know for sure from the flight recorders, the EFR, is that those switches did move from run to cut off. The fuel was cut. That physical event happened. That's black and white data.
But, and this is the massive but, the preliminary report, crucially, does not tell us whether this was a mechanical failure, electrical issue, or software anomaly. It states the what switches moved, but offers zero explanation for the how or the why, what caused them to move. And critically, there was no camera in cockpit. We don't have visual proof. We can't see if a hand moved them accidentally or deliberately, or if they moved on their own accord. This raises an important question. How can you definitively pin it on pilot error, or even heavily imply it, without explaining the root cause of that switch movement? The report leaves this huge causal gap wide open.
Okay, let's bring some other details now. Things that add layers of complexity and, frankly, concern. Uncomfortable echoes, maybe. Our sources point out something significant about this specific aircraft, AI-171. Before its final flight, it flew as AI-432 from Delhi to Ahmedabad. And on that flight, the previous crew had logged a fault code, specifically related to a stabilizer position sensor, SecDate POS-XDCR. That sensor helps control the plane's pitch. Now, Air India later said they had fixed or troubleshooted this issue before the fatal flight. They acknowledged the fault, claimed it was resolved.
Right. And while the stabilizer sensor might seem totally unrelated to fuel switches, think about it this way. What's fascinating here is the implication. If one complex sensor system on that plane was known to be acting up, generating errors, well, it naturally makes you ask, could other sensors, other electrical systems, maybe even switches that seem purely mechanical, also have underlying problems, latent issues, things that weren't fully fixed? It's not about blaming that specific sensor, but it points to the possibility of wider system health issues on that particular airframe. And this leads us straight into something truly crucial, a piece of information from years before this crash.
Yeah, prepare for this one, because this connects directly to those fuel switches and really sharpens the focus on potential systemic problems. On December 17th, 2018, that's almost 7 years before the AI-171 crash, the FAA, the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration, issued something called a Special Airworthiness Information Bulletin, or SAIB, a formal warning. And this bulletin stated, I'm quoting directly here, the Boeing company received reports from operators of Model 737 airplanes that the fuel control switches were installed with the locking feature disengaged. Did you catch that? The fuel control switches, the exact type involved here, found on some planes with their main safety locking feature disengaged. This wasn't a theory. Boeing itself reported this finding to the FAA.
And let's be absolutely clear about this locking feature. It's not a minor detail. It's fundamental to the switch's safe operation. Its entire purpose is to prevent inadvertent operation and unintended switch movement. It's that physical mechanism we talked about lifting against the spring before sliding. That's the lock. It's a core safety barrier. And the FAA bulletin was warning that on some switches, this barrier might simply not be working, making the switch much, much easier to move accidentally.
The FAA bulletin didn't mince words about the danger either. It stated clearly that if this locking feature was disengaged, the switch can be moved between two positions without lifting the switch during transition. And the switch would be exposed to the potential of inadvertent operation, meaning a simple bump, a brush, something that shouldn't move it, could move it if that lock wasn't engaged. And the terrifying, explicit potential consequence of that inadvertent operation, spelled out right there in the bulletin. It wasn't just a warning light, it was in-flight engine shutdown. Think about that. A known documented potential defect in these switches, specifically the disengaged lock, could directly cause an engine to stop mid-flight. And AI-171 lost both engines.
This is such a critical link. It's absolutely vital. Because while the bulletin started with reports on the 737, the list of aircraft potentially affected, right there in the bulletin, clearly states that the same switch was installed in the 787 model, the exact same switch. So if we connect this to the bigger picture, what happened on AI-171 wasn't necessarily some bizarre, unique pilot error that came out of nowhere. It aligns perfectly with a known, documented potential flaw in the very component that failed, a flaw Boeing knew about years earlier. This changes the whole conversation, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It shifts focus from an unexplained human action to a potential known hardware vulnerability.
And how did Boeing handle this bulletin? Our sources describe their response as clever. The information in that FAA bulletin was issued only as a recommendation. It wasn't a mandatory airworthiness directive requiring immediate action. They flagged the issue, put it out there, but didn't force airlines to inspect or replace the switches.
Which, again, raises that important question about motivation and liability, doesn't it? By making it just advisory, Boeing could later say, well, we told you about the potential issue. It effectively helps them shake off the problem from their own plate, as one source put it. It shifts the burden onto the airlines. If an airline didn't act on the recommendation and something happened, Boeing has a degree of cover. It's a way to manage risk, perhaps, but it doesn't necessarily maximize immediate safety across the fleet.
And Air India's response. Because it wasn't mandatory, Air India did not inspect or replace those specific fuel switches on the aircraft that became AI-171, even though, ironically, they had done other major work on that exact plane, like replacing the throttle control unit twice in 2019 and 2023. Even an engine had been replaced. So other big expensive parts were maintained. But this specific switch, flagged in an FAA bulletin, was left as it was. Okay, let's unpack this. It shows a maintenance gap, yes, but a gap that was essentially permitted because the warning wasn't compulsory. Air India followed the rules, technically, by not acting on a non-mandatory bulletin.
So where does that leave us? Pilot error is still technically on the table. You can't rule it out completely without a truly transparent investigation. But given everything we've just discussed, it seems equally possible that this is a switch problem. Maybe a mechanical defect, that locking feature failing exactly as the FAA warned. Or maybe an electrical short inside the switch, causing it to command an engine shutdown. That 2018 FAA bulletin warning about this exact scenario, disengaged locks leading to in-flight shutdown, gives enormous weight to the hardware malfunction theory. It's not just speculation anymore, it's based on a documented vulnerability.
And the pilots themselves, or at least their representatives, the Indian Pilot Association, they've been very vocal about this. They've criticized the secrecy around the investigation, the lack of consultation with pilots, and how the preliminary report seemed to gloss over the serviceability issue of the fuel switch while leaning towards pilot error. They feel the investigation just isn't credible without fully digging into this switch issue and its history. And you hear echoes of that concern from pilots globally.
And sadly, this whole situation feels uncomfortably familiar, drawing parallels to Boeing's more recent history. Remember the 737MX, how Boeing initially handled the MCAS system issues. The company was widely seen to have hidden the truth, or at least downplayed the significance of MCS, which relied on a single sensor and contributed to 2 horrific crashes, killing 346 people. Information was withheld from pilots and regulators until the second crash forced everything into the open. Just like a single faulty sensor could activate MCOs with devastating results, it's entirely plausible that a faulty switch, especially one with a known potential defect, could bring down a plane, particularly during takeoff. The pattern downplaying known flaws, potential lack of transparency, shifting blame, it feels eerily, chillingly similar to what might be happening with AI-171.
So let's tie this together. The preliminary report for AI-171 comes out and surprisingly states no action should be taken now regarding these switches on the Boeing 787 fleet. It implies everything's fine. Software, hardware, the spring loading, the locking mechanism, all okay, despite the FAA's own warning years prior.
And that dismissal, that casual nothing to see here regarding a known potential fault with such horrific potential consequences, well, it does strongly suggest some sort of a cover-up, as our sources put it. It's hard not to feel that way. It's incredibly concerning. Because if this issue is just brushed under the carpet, if these switches aren't properly checked across the whole 787 fleet, the consequences could be unthinkable. What's fascinating, in a truly grim way, is the potential for history to repeat itself. Another tragedy stemming from the exact same documented vulnerability, we're talking about people's lives here, no action required feels profoundly inadequate.
To put it bluntly, if these switches aren't checked thoroughly across the fleet, don't be surprised if another 787 crashes tomorrow because of a switch. The risk, based on the FAA's own bulletin and the events of AI-171, appears to remain active and unresolved. This goes way beyond just one tragic flight.
Indeed. We've seen this narrative before. Boeing has arguably done cover-ups before, referencing the 737 MAX fallout. The secrecy around the AI-171 report, its quiet release, no press conference, the way it seems to point fingers at the deceased pilots. This raises that crucial question again. Is this another instance of a powerful corporation potentially trying to manage a systemic issue by controlling the narrative rather than tackling it head-on with full transparency and accountability? The parallels are just too strong to ignore.
So what does this all mean for you? For anyone who travels? For anyone who cares about aviation safety? What are the real implications when a preliminary report seems to downplay a critical, known hardware vulnerability? Especially when you weigh it against the tragedy itself and against that history of corporate interests sometimes clashing with safety imperatives. It leaves us asking some really profound questions about who is ultimately responsible, about transparency, and about the true cost when safety might not be the absolute first priority. We've taken a really deep dive today into the AI-171 crash, trying to peel back the layers on this devastating event. It started as a timeline of a tragedy, but quickly became this complex story, a story of possible pilot error versus highly suspicious technical failures, all set against this backdrop of Boeing's difficult history.
And that core tension is still there, isn't it? Was it a highly uncharacteristic human mistake under impossible pressure? Or was it a catastrophic failure caused by a known technical flaw? A flaw that maybe was downplayed or ignored? For safety, real safety, knowledge is most valuable when understood and applied. Transparency, rigorous independent investigation, real accountability. These aren't just buzzwords. They're absolutely essential to prevent this from ever happening again. Without knowing the true cause of those switches moving, without addressing that known vulnerability, can we really say the risk has been eliminated?
Ultimately, this deep dive leaves us thinking hard about responsibility, about how investigations are conducted, especially when powerful players are involved, and about the real cost where reputation might be prioritized over safety. The answers, or perhaps the lack of clear answers so far, really matter to everyone. So as you think about this incredibly complex and disturbing case, what stands out to you? How do these investigations unfold when big interests are potentially at stake? And where do you think the responsibility truly lies when something like AI-171 happens?